remember the day Marilyn first showed me the flyer for the discounted meat. 2 for $1. It read in bright red letters, perched atop a stack of coupons she'd found in the local grocery store. It was mid-July, and we were planning the final food inventory for Camp Winfield before the kids arrived the following week. Marilyn, the camp director, and my best friend since college, was always hunting for bargains, and this particular discount seemed too good to pass up. The two of us were rarely apart in those early days of camp setup. We'd arrive together at the crack of dawn to check the cabins, stock the arts and craft supplies, and verify that the lake and the canoes were safe for the kids. Marilyn was the driving force behind everything. She had a knack for rallying the staff's spirits even in the thick heat of summer. So, when she insisted that the cut of meat labelled 2 for $1 would help us stretch our tight camp budget, I shrugged, trusting her judgment. We picked up the packages from a small butcher shop on the outskirts of town. The owner was a wiry old man with suspiciously dark, sunken eyes. He didn't say much except for a few grunts as he rang up our purchase. Later, we drove back to the camp freezer and unloaded our haul. Marilyn whistled as she stashed the meat in the far corner. Just imagine, this is enough to feed everybody on a couple of special nights. I helped her with a smile, unaware of just how special those nights would turn out to be. In the first couple of weeks, everything went smoothly, or at least as smoothly as a chaotic summer camp could. The kids arrived in throngs, their parents driving them down the pine tree-lined gravel roads. Counselors hustled to their stations, the cooks to the mess hall, and we all tried to keep the endless swirl of energy in check. Marilyn and I often joked that if we could corral 40 hypercampers for a month, we could probably handle anything life threw at us. On the second weekend, we decided to use a portion of the discounted meat for a campsite barbecue. The staff and the kids were excited, the grill sizzling away as we served up burgers and hot dogs. Marilyn, as always, was right in the thick of it, flipping patties, cracking jokes, stealing an occasional hot dog for herself. A couple of the counselors poked fun at the label. Who sells meat 2 for $1? Isn't that a little suspicious? But Marilyn, ever the optimist, replied, Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Plus it tastes just fine. And it did taste fine that night, maybe a bit gamier than usual, but no one complained. If anything, the kids chowed down with gusto. By the end of the evening, we were all happily exhausted, and the staff herded everyone back to their cabins. Later, Marilyn and I lingered by the dying embers of the fire, looking out over the shimmering lake. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue, sprinkled with stars that made the surface of the water glitter. The next few days ticked by in the usual summertime blur: archery lessons, arts and crafts sessions, sunny afternoons at the lake. On Wednesday morning, Marilyn started complaining of mild stomach pains. At first, it didn't seem alarming. We'd both eaten a lot of barbecue, and sometimes camp food can do a number on the best of us. We laughed about it, saying maybe we overdid it on s'mores. However, by Thursday evening, she looked noticeably pale. She stayed near the mess hall bathrooms for most of dinner, grimacing every so often. At first, she attributed her discomfort to a bad bout of indigestion or some routine bug going around. But when she confided in me on Friday morning that she'd noticed blood in her stool, I felt a chill pass through me. "You need to see a doctor," I told her, my voice catching in my throat. Yet Marilyn, in typical Marilyn fashion, refused to go. "I can't abandon the camp," she said. "We're short-handed as it is, and the kids are expecting the big bonfire night tomorrow." Reluctantly, I watched her push through the day with a forced smile. She managed the usual staff meetings, reassured a few homesick kids, and even participated in a canoe race. But when the sun set, her face was drawn and clammy, and she spent more and more time hunched over in pain. I tried again to get her to see a doctor, but she insisted on waiting until Sunday, when she had a scheduled appointment in town to pick up new supplies anyway. By the final week of camp, Marilyn's complexion had turned sallow, and her eyes had deep circles underneath. Still, she greeted everyone with her trademark warmth, refusing to show weakness in front of the children. I knew she wasn't eating much, even though she was preparing meals alongside our cooks. She was also unbelievably tired, to the point where she'd excuse herself mid-lunch to lie down. Then came that last night, one I will never forget as long as I live. The evening was stormy, which was rare for late July. The wind howled through the tall pines, and thunder rumbled in the distance like a drum roll of doom. The kids were growing restless in their cabins, and the lights flickered a couple of times as we hurried about, lighting lanterns just in case. I was checking on cabin 5 when one of the junior counselors ran up to me, panic etched on her face. "Marilyn collapsed," she wheezed between breaths. "She's in the main lodge." My heart seized. I bolted through the heavy rain and into the large wooden building that served as our central meeting point. Inside, it was dimly lit by a few flickering lamps. Marilyn lay on one of the sofas, her eyes open but glazed over. She murmured something unintelligible as I kneeled beside her. I noticed sweat beading on her forehead and her arms trembling. Another counselor hovered nearby, stammering, "We tried the phone line for an ambulance, but there's no dial tone. The storm must have knocked something out. The internet is gone too." "Get towels, water," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "I'll stay with her." I pressed a damp cloth to Marilyn's forehead and whispered her name. She blinked once, focusing on me briefly, but her voice was too weak to speak. Then her body jerked, a violent spasmodic movement that nearly flung my hand aside. A wet cough tore from her throat, and my stomach twisted in dread. She convulsed again, and this time she opened her mouth wide. I heard a choked gurgling sound, and then something writhed against her lips. A thin, pale, worm-like creature, glistening with fluids, slithered from inside her mouth. I recoiled, stifling a scream. The worm squirmed free, dropping onto the sofa. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were frozen. Then Marilyn's head jerked back, and more of these wriggling horrors began spilling from her nose, the corners of her eyes, and even her ears. A counselor behind me let out a terrified wail, which seemed to break my paralysis. I scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp in my haste. Marilyn's body, once so vibrant, was still, except for the grotesque movements under her skin. It looked as though dozens of serpentine shapes were tunneling just beneath her flesh, searching for a way out. Some broke through at the corners of her lips or forced their way through her eyes. I was shaking so badly I could hardly stand, but my instincts kicked in. I shouted at the counselor to get the children away from the lodge, to close and lock every door and window. But it was too late. Those twisted pale worms were already slithering across the floor. They moved in a nightmarish wave, spreading out in all directions. One staff member tried to stomp on them, but the worms were faster. I saw them latch onto an unsuspecting junior counselor's ankle, boring into the skin. The poor counselor screamed and collapsed as the worms began creeping up her leg. My heart pounded, and I thought I would faint from the sheer horror of it all. I stumbled outside into the storm, my clothes instantly soaked by the downpour. Lightning flashed, illuminating the chaos. Staff and older campers, running in all directions, some already on the ground, writhing in agony. The storm had knocked out the power fully by now, so everything was drenched in darkness, broken only by bursts of lightning and the glow of a few flashlights. Rain pelted my face, but I could still sense the creeping terror of those parasitic worms all around. I grabbed a lantern from a hook and swung it wildly to keep any stray creatures away. The kids were screaming in their cabins, some older ones trying to hold the doors shut. But in the next flash of lightning, I saw them, long, winding trails of worms slithering across the muddy paths, seeking new hosts. Somehow, I managed to find shelter in the staff office, a small building near the edge of camp. My heart raced as I rummaged desperately for the radio we occasionally used to contact the local ranger station. The radio, which had been finicky all summer, crackled with static. Nothing. It had apparently quit working entirely weeks ago. With phone lines down, no internet, and a broken radio, we were completely cut off. The next few hours were a blur of panicked screams, pounding rain, and my own adrenaline-fueled terror. I tried to help where I could, barricading doors, warning people to stay off the floors if they saw any worms. But the infestation spread too fast. Anyone who came into contact with the parasites ended up on the ground, convulsing, with the creatures disappearing into their bodies. By the time dawn broke, Camp Winfield was silent except for the constant rain, which had turned from a torrential downpour to a steady drizzle. The rising sun revealed a scene that I can only describe as a nightmare, painted in daylight. Several people lay on the muddy ground, motionless, their faces contorted in final agony. Others were conscious but clearly infected, moving in listless, uncoordinated ways, as if battling something inside. I forced myself to return to the main lodge, where I found Marilyn's body. She lay slumped on the sofa, her eyes wide open, but unseeing. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and dotted with tiny holes where the worms had emerged. A pang of grief hit me so hard that I dropped to my knees. She was gone, my friend, the heart and soul of this camp. I wanted nothing more than to call for help, but we were still isolated. The storm had done its job too well. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the parents began to arrive for pickup. The storm had delayed them, but the camp session was officially ending that day, and they came in cars and vans, some of them honking or calling out names. What they found when they stepped onto the campgrounds was a surreal, horrifying scene. Staff members staggering around with vacant stares, their bodies ravaged by the parasites. Children with feverish, glassy eyes, some collapsing in their parents' arms. A few of the luckier parents had the presence of mind to keep their distance. They screamed at the others to stay in their vehicles, to call an ambulance. But the phone lines were still down, and nobody had any cell service this far out in the woods. The next wave of horror hit as they discovered the deceased. 2 counselors sprawled near the dining hall's threshold, 3 children lying beside the lake's edge, and, of course, Marilyn in the main lodge. Shouts and sobs began to ripple through the camp. Some parents grabbed their children, ignoring the risk of infection, and sped off down the gravel road, hoping to find help in the nearest town. Others were too shocked or disoriented to do anything but stand there, calling out for spouses or neighbours, for some sort of assistance. I wanted to console them, to somehow explain what had happened, but there were no words to do so. Instead, I stood there, drenched and trembling, on the front steps of the main lodge, my mind replaying the final moments of Marilyn's life. We had been so close, 2 best friends running a summer camp. It should have been a place where kids made happy memories, canoe races, bonfires, silly cabin pranks. Instead, it had become a nightmare. Even now, I don't fully understand how it all happened, whether it was the cheap meat harboring some strange parasite, or if the butcher had unwittingly sold us contaminated stock. All I know is that, in the end, those worms had multiplied inside Marilyn until they burst free, wreaking havoc on everyone around. It's a scene I will never be able to erase from my memory. Marilyn's final breath, her eyes rolling back, and then the flood of pale, writhing bodies spilling from every orifice. The relentless storm, the darkness, the screams, and the desperate hopelessness we felt, cut off from any rescue by downed phone lines, broken radio equipment, and the sheer brutality of that night. When the parents finally peeled out of the camp's driveway with the survivors, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I sat on the front porch of the main lodge, by Marilyn's body, until the sirens of approaching ambulances and police cars finally broke the silence. I don't know what became of the ones who escaped, whether the parasites managed to spread beyond the camp. All I know is that Camp Winfield, the place I once thought of as a second home, now haunts my nightmares. And every time I see a sign that reads 2 for $1, I feel that old, familiar chill, remembering how one simple bargain set off a chain of horrors that no amount of apologies or explanations could ever undo.